If you opened your spice drawer right now, you would be looking at one of the strangest maps in human history. Tiny jars of black pepper, chili, and cumin sit side by side like they have always belonged together. But they did not. Each one began in a very specific corner of the planet, in a climate and landscape that shaped it long before it ever reached your kitchen. On this channel, we have already gone deep into individual spices, but today I want to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Once you connect the origins of spices to where they are grown now, you start to see something much bigger than food. You see trade, empire, migration, secrecy, and the way human beings have spent thousands of years moving flavor across the world. If that kind of thing fascinates you, and if you like these hidden historical stories behind everyday ingredients, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, because once you see this map, you cannot really unsee it. Black pepper came from the humid forests of India's Malabar Coast. Chili peppers were born in the Americas and only later spread across Asia. Cumin seems to have emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia before becoming a staple in India. And today, the places that grow these spices at scale are often nowhere near the places that first gave them to the world. Before we go any further, let us define the word spice the way I am using it here. I mean the intense plant parts we use for flavor and aroma, usually dried, not for calories. Seeds like black pepper and cumin, bark like cinnamon, flower buds like cloves, roots like turmeric, pods like vanilla. These are the small things that can completely change a dish. Now let us zoom out and start with the map itself. The first thing you notice about spices is that they do not come from one place. They come from pockets, small ecological pockets, each with the right mix of temperature, moisture, soil, and local ecology. That is why spices are never just natural in a broad sense. They are products of very specific landscapes. Black pepper belongs to the wet, shaded world of southwestern India. For centuries, the Malabar Coast was the source that the rest of the world depended on. Long before global shipping, pepper was moving out through Indian Ocean trade networks into the hands of Arab merchants, then onward through the Red Sea and overland routes into the Mediterranean. That route mattered because it turned pepper into something much bigger than a seasoning. It became a luxury, a currency, and a symbol of power. Europe wanted it. Venice profited from it. And later, colonial empires would go looking for direct access to it because they hated the middlemen and wanted the margins for themselves. Today, the geography is different. Vietnam is now the dominant giant in black pepper production, with India still important and Indonesia and Brazil also major producers. So, if you buy pepper today, there is a good chance it came from a plantation far away from the vine's original home in Kerala. And that is the pattern that keeps repeating. Cinnamon has a similar story, but with a different kind of secrecy around it. True Ceylon cinnamon is native to Sri Lanka, and for centuries that island was the key source of the world's most delicate cinnamon bark. Arab traders understood the value of that bark, and they also understood that mystery protected profit. So instead of explaining where it came from, they helped surround cinnamon with myths and distance. That is why cinnamon became one of those spices people talked about almost like treasure. Not just because it tasted good, but because the route to it was hidden, expensive, and controlled. Later, European powers tried to seize that control directly, because once a spice becomes rare, it stops being food and starts becoming strategy. Today, cinnamon production is no longer locked to one island. Sri Lanka still matters, but cinnamon and cinnamon-like crops are also grown in places like Madagascar, Seychelles, and other tropical regions. The old monopoly is gone. The geography has been opened up. Then you get to the Spice Islands, and the story becomes even more dramatic. Cloves, nutmeg and mace once came from a tiny cluster of islands in the Maluku archipelago of Indonesia. For a long time, those islands were not just important, they were the world. If you wanted these spices, you went there or you bought them through a chain of traders who went there for you. That kind of concentration is exactly what made them so valuable. And it is also why colonial powers became so ruthless around them. The Dutch tried to control these crops by controlling the trees, the islands and the people. But once seedlings were moved elsewhere, the monopoly started to collapse. That is how clove cultivation eventually spread to places like Zanzibar. And that is how nutmeg became associated with Grenada in the Caribbean. A spice that had once been geographically trapped on a few volcanic islands was turned into a global crop through violence, smuggling, and forced relocation. Now shift to a very different climate and a very different kind of spice. Cumin belongs to the dry world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. It appears in ancient records in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and later medieval Europe. In written records, it shows up very early in Mesopotamia, which makes it one of those spices that has been sitting at the table of human history since the beginning. It was used in food, medicine, ritual, and even as a kind of everyday economic object in some places. This was not a rare luxury spice. It was a spice that kept moving because people kept finding reasons to use it. That is what makes cumin different from some of the other spices in this story. It was never only about status, it was also about survival, flavor, and practicality. Ancient cooks used it because it worked. Healers used it because they thought it worked. Traders carried it because people wanted it and because it traveled well as a dry seed. What makes cumin especially interesting is that it never stayed in one cultural lane. Romans used it. The Bible mentions it. Islamic and medieval trade carried it farther, and eventually it became so deeply integrated into South Asian cooking that most people today would never guess how old and wide its journey really is. There is also something almost beautiful about how cumin survived the collapse of so many old worlds. Empires came and went, languages changed, trade routes shifted, but cumin stayed useful. It kept moving because it was never tied to a single elite court or one prestige cuisine. It became a spice of continuity. Today, cumin is overwhelmingly grown in India, especially in Gujarat and Rajasthan, with India producing the majority of the global supply. That is the twist. One of the world's oldest recorded spices is now most strongly associated with a place that made it part of everyday cooking rather than just ancient trade. And if you zoom in even further, that modern production story matters because it shows how a spice can be ancient in origin, but modern in geography. Cumin is still traded globally, but the center of gravity has moved. The history remains old. The map is new. Between the ancient Near East and South Asia, there is a whole belt of spice history that often gets overlooked. This is the belt of dry lands, caravan routes, market towns, and overlapping empires. It is the kind of geography that does not produce one single dramatic origin story, but instead a long chain of exchange. In those regions, spices were not always separated from medicine or ritual. They were used together. People paid attention to smell, warmth, preservation, and perceived health effects all at once. That is part of why spices became so valuable. They were not just taste, they were a whole system of meaning, and that system moved with people. As merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and settlers crossed the region, they carried seeds in sacks, in cargo holds, and sometimes simply in their memory of how something should taste. That is how a plant becomes part of a culture, not just by growing there, but by being repeated there. This is also where the story starts to feel modern, because the same logic still applies today. The country that has the best climate for a crop is not always the one that will end up dominating it. Trade infrastructure, labor, access to ports, and agricultural scale all matter. That is why it makes sense that cumin could be ancient in origin and yet overwhelmingly Indian in production. And it is why black pepper could begin on the Malabar Coast and then become a major export from Vietnam. Geography sets the first chapter, economics writes the later ones. And then there is saffron, which shows just how extreme spice geography can become. Saffron comes from a crocus flower, and each flower produces only a few fragile red stigmas. That means saffron is not just grown, it is harvested one flower at a time by hand. That alone makes the crop dramatic. The real story is that the plant needs the right climate, the right labor, and the right patience. This is why saffron never became a casual mass crop in the same way as pepper or cumin. Its value is tied to scarcity and labor intensity. The geography matters, but so does the amount of work embedded in every gram. Historically, saffron belongs to the wider belt of Western Asia and the Mediterranean. But today, Iran is the giant. Whole regions there are built around saffron harvests, and the spice has become inseparable from the country's agricultural identity. Spain and Kashmir still matter, but Iran is where the scale lives now. That creates a different kind of spice map. Not one based on conquest alone, but one based on a crop whose economics are almost painfully human. Every autumn, the same basic scene repeats. People walk fields before sunrise, flowers open briefly, and the red threads have to be removed by hand before the value disappears. Saffron is a reminder that some spices do not become powerful because they are easy to grow. They become powerful because they are hard to replace. Which brings us to the most famous example of a spice leaving home and changing the world completely. Chili peppers were born in the Americas. That is the starting point. Before Europeans reached the New World, there was no chili heat in India, no chili in Sichuan, no chili in Thai curries, and no chili in Korean food. Then the plants began moving. Spanish and Portuguese sailors carried chili peppers out of the New World and into Europe, Africa, and Asia. The spread was fast enough that within a few generations, chilies were everywhere in the places that would later become most associated with them. That is one of the wildest parts of the whole story. A crop that did not exist in Asia before the early modern period became so normal there that many people now think of it as native. That is how deeply a plant can rewrite a cuisine when the trade routes line up and the climate cooperates. And because chili was easy to grow, it spread even faster. It did not need specialized tree crops, rare pollinators, or carefully guarded islands. It could be planted, shared, and adapted almost anywhere warm enough to support it. That made it one of the most successful botanical migrants in human history. That is why chili is such a powerful example of culinary globalization. It moved so completely that it stopped feeling foreign. It became local almost everywhere it landed. And finally, we get to vanilla. Vanilla started in Mexico, where indigenous communities knew the plant long before Europe did. For a long time, vanilla was tied to a very specific ecology and a very specific pollination problem, which made it hard to grow elsewhere. This is one of those rare moments where botany itself shaped world trade. The plant could grow in many tropical regions, but it would not reliably fruit without the right pollination. That meant the flavor remained limited until humans figured out how to intervene. That changed when hand pollination was discovered and spread through tropical colonies. Suddenly, vanilla could be turned into a plantation crop. Today, Madagascar dominates world production, with Indonesia and a few other tropical regions also playing major roles. So the world's favorite dessert flavor is really the result of a long migration from Mesoamerica to the Indian Ocean. And that migration matters because it shows the difference between growing a plant and producing a commodity. Vanilla was never just moved as a botanical specimen. It was moved as a business model. The bean, the method, and the market all had to travel together. When you line all of this up, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Spices are born in narrow ecological pockets. They get pulled into trade routes. They get guarded, stolen, replanted, and scaled somewhere else. And over time, the map of production stops matching the map of origin. That is why spices are never just about food. They are about who controlled the root, who controlled the seed, and who controlled the labor. In some cases, the spice itself became a weapon of empire. In others, it became a quiet crop that sustained whole regions. But in every case, it moved people, money, and power. So the next time you crack black pepper over dinner, add cumin to a pan, or throw chilies into a dish, you are not just cooking. You are touching a centuries-old chain of roots, empires, labor systems, and migrations that stretched across oceans and continents. That is what makes spices so much more interesting than they look. They are tiny, but the history behind them is enormous.